Good morning. So today we're actually bringing to a close the series that we've been running with for a number of months now around the victorious church. And today I really wanted to look at having victory over the past. How we can have individually and corporately victory over things that have gone on and happened in our lives, and how we can walk victoriously in that. And as I was reflecting on sort of endings and closure, we're coming to a time as a country where we're meeting certain milestones, and we can really see tangibly in the near future a real moving on and a closing of this permanency of lockdown and social distancing measures. And for me, and I'm having to come to terms with having stuff in the calendar again. I've got so used to just maybe accepting, any kind of invitation, sort of knowing, well, we haven't really got anything in the calendar. But we thank God that actually, we've been able to socialise more. Our kids are able to get in more to clubs and activities, and there's a sense of normalcy being brought back, and not least in the near future being able to meet with you all again face to face more regularly and more easily. And for us that bring the word on a regular basis, we're going to have to get used to not being able to turn off the video if we make a mistake, and only having one take and that's it when we get back to meeting more regularly in person. But also, as I've reflected on this last, 12 to 18 months, and in conversations recently with others, there can be a sense of, in conversation and reflection, that this last 12 to 18 months have been wasted, lost even. There's been experiences that we should have had and would have had. There would have been things that we would have done that we should have done, opportunities that were there to be grasped, doors to be able to be walked through that we haven't been able to do, relationships that would have maybe been nurtured or flourished or even started in a better way. Grandchildren or children that you haven't been able to see grow up or see as much as you may would have expected, and of course would have wanted to. And that can, in varying degrees, bring feelings of anger, of annoyance, of resentment, of regret, and even bitterness. And as I thought about this, a passage that really came to mind was Ecclesiastes chapter 3, a time for everything. And just a short video just to sort of bring out the great stuff in that particular passage.
For everything that happens in life, there is a season, a right time for everything under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to collect the harvest, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to cry, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to scatter stones, a time to pile them up, a time for a warm embrace, a time for keeping your distance, a time to search, a time to give up as lost, a time to keep, a time to throw out, a time to tear apart, a time to bind together, a time to be quiet, a time to speak up, a time to love, a time to hate, a time to go to war, a time to make peace. I know everything God does endures for all time. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken away from it. We humans can only stand in awe of all God has done. What has been and what is to be already is, and God holds accountable all the pursuits of humanity.
A time to embrace and a time to keep your distance. I think now more than ever that particular verse has taken on a whole new meaning. The writer in Ecclesiastes is really bringing out here the brokenness of our world. We see in Genesis 3 verses 17 to 19 that God, after Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, God saying to Adam, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it. All the days of your life it will produce thorns and thistles for you. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. This passage that we see in Ecclesiastes is not hiding from that fact. It's not brushing over it or brushing it under the carpet that we indeed live in a broken world. That yes, there is a time to be loving, but there's a time for hating. Yes, there is a time for laughing, but there is a time also for weeping. There is a time for dancing, but there is also a time for mourning. We don't just simply go, gloss over that and simply look forward to better times, but acknowledge that everything has its time, everything has its season. But what we don't do is we don't let the brokenness of the world blind us to its beauty. We don't let the brokenness of the world blind us to its beauty. Further on in that chapter of Ecclesiastes 3, the writer then talks about that, there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. That there is beauty to be found in the world, and that is the gift of God. So we affirm, and it can be confusing and frustrating, because there's this tension between the brokenness of the world and its beauty. And understandably, we kind of want answers now. We want clarity now. How does that work out? Where is God really in this? But again, in this chapter of Ecclesiastes, the writer says that he has made everything beautiful in its time, that being God, but he has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So those answers that we're seeking of that tension between brokenness and beauty, between, what God desires for all of our lives, but what is happening for us individually and corporately, and what has happened. Those answers aren't for this world, they aren't for this time. God has set eternity in our hearts, and it's not for now to fathom what God has done from beginning to end. But also, we need to affirm, and this can be difficult, and is difficult, that this is not God's desire, this brokenness of the world. And this brokenness that is demonstrated in one way in the pandemic and what we've gone through in the last 12 to 18 months, this brokenness, although it is not God's desire, God is still in control. And that, I know, for many people can be really difficult. God's desire for the world was displayed in the Garden of Eden before the fall. And now we live in a very different world, a very different universe, where there's brokenness, where there's death, where there is decay. But God is still in control. And we could talk about that for hours. We could have a long theological, in-depth debate of how an all-knowing, an all-powerful God, whose desire is very different to what we see around us, can still be in control. But at the end of the day, it comes down to simply a decision that each of us needs to make. Because we can talk about it until we're blue in the face, but the decision that we all need to make and come to is, where is our trust? Where do we place our trust? Do we have trust in a good God that, as we read in Ecclesiastes, makes everything beautiful in its time? That there is a season for everything, especially in this broken world, but in all seasons, God is making things beautiful. God is outworking his goodness through all things. it comes to, comes to that decision. Do we trust in a good God that in all things is making things beautiful? A person in the Bible that exemplified this was Joseph. Joseph, who was rejected by his brothers, betrayed by his brothers, and sold into slavery. And then, for no fault of his own, was accused of something that he didn't do and was thrown into prison. And then after a time was then brought into servitude to a foreign power under Pharaoh. But God had his hand on Joseph. God, in each of those times, certainly you can read in the last few chapters of Genesis, God's hand of how he was with Joseph, of how he made beautiful those seasons of rejection, of being degraded, of abuse, of separation from family. God was in that to actually restoring and putting Joseph in a position where in Egypt he was only second to Pharaoh. And near the end, or at the very end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 50, we see clearly the decision that Joseph has made when he looks back at all that has happened to him, all of the things that he has gone through, all of the resentment that he could have felt. We can see the decision that he chooses to make. Because we read in Genesis 50 that Joseph's father Jacob has died, and his brothers become very fearful. They become fearful of, now maybe this is the time that Joseph is going to bring his revenge or bring retribution to us. And we read, this is from verse 16 in Genesis 50, that they, Joseph's brothers, they sent word to him saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, this is the decision that Joseph makes. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph made a conscious decision to believe that to really believe kind of what we were going back to before, that even though there was brokenness in the world, even though it wasn't maybe God's intentions, God was still in control. Joseph was able to look back at the circumstances and the situations that he had been in, the relationships that had broken down, and still affirm that God was in control. There were all of those things that would have maybe been outworked or intended to bring Joseph down. God had made beautiful. God had intended it and brought out good from it. He looked at the challenges that he had faced, the difficulty, the abuse and the rejection, and he refused to give in to anger. He refused to give in to resentment. He refused to give in to bitterness. And actually victoriously for him, in a way that he could walk in further in the future, to say no. God has intended that for good. Even in those bad and dark seasons, God still made it beautiful. God still outworked it for his purposes so that many lives could be saved. So just as Joseph did, we have a similar decision to make, I believe, right now. As we do move in all hope and faithfulness, that we move into and as best as we can a normal way of living back to what we were used to. As we move out of this particular difficult season that could have been, I'm sure, in terms of Satan is wanting that to be worked out for evil, to be a bondage on people, to be bringing people down, to be niggling at people for a long period of time, for people to hold on to feelings of resentment, anger, finger pointing, blame and bitterness. The evil one is wanting that, for people to hold on to that. But we can make today a decision to say no. We believe in a God that even in the brokenness of the world, we believe in a God that is still in control. We trust in a God that makes everything beautiful in its time. And we believe and trust in a God that can outwork, even in the darkest and most challenging of circumstances, God can still outwork for good. That we refuse individually and corporately to walk in feelings of resentment, of regret and bitterness and unforgiveness. And we will walk as individuals, as families and as a church in the full knowledge that our God has and will continue to make all things beautiful in its time, and that he will and he has and will continue to bring good out of any situation. Amen.